The current situation regarding atrocities and targeted violence against Hindus in Bangladesh cannot be understood as a sudden or isolated breakdown of law and order, but rather as the latest and most acute phase of a long-running structural crisis involving minority vulnerability, political instability, religious radicalisation, impunity for perpetrators, and repeated failures of state protection that have intensified dramatically since late 2024 and throughout 2025-26, particularly following regime instability and power transitions that historically coincide with spikes in communal violence in Bangladesh. Over the past few weeks alone, multiple verified incidents, including the beating to death of Hindu businessmen and workers, mob lynchings over fabricated blasphemy accusations, attacks on Hindu-owned homes and businesses, destruction and desecration of temples, forced displacement, land grabbing, and sexual violence, have been reported by Indian, Bangladeshi, and international media as well as by human rights organizations, creating a climate of fear so pervasive that Hindu families across districts such as Ghazipur, Khulna, Rangpur, Chittagong Hill Tracts, and parts of Dhaka's periphery are either fleeing internally, attempting illegal migration, or living in near-constant lockdown within their own villages. Recent killings, including the January 2026 murder of a Hindu petrol pump worker crushed under a vehicle and the lynching of Hindu laborers under mob justice narratives, are not aberrations, but rather part of a statistically documented surge, with independent rights groups such as the Rights and Risks Analysis Group reporting at least 15 Hindu murders in just 45 days between December 2025 and mid-January 2026. While broader compilations from international media and watchdogs suggest dozens of killings and thousands of violent incidents when including arson, assault, rape, extortion, and forced eviction, this escalation follows an even larger wave of anti-Hindu violence during and after the political upheavals of 2024, when more than 2,000 incidents were officially recorded, over 150 temples damaged, and entire Hindu neighborhoods targeted in coordinated attacks, often triggered by rumors on social media, fabricated allegations of blasphemy, or deliberate political mobilization that framed Hindus as proxies for rival parties or as obstacles to land acquisition. What makes the current phase particularly alarming is not merely the number of incidents, but the apparent erosion of deterrence mechanisms, as eyewitness accounts and investigative reports repeatedly describe police inaction, delayed responses, or passive observation during mob violence, reinforcing a perception among perpetrators that violence against Hindus carries minimal risk of punishment. A dynamic long noted by Amnesty International and minority rights group International in their assessments of Bangladesh's minority protection failures. The socio-political drivers of this violence are layered and mutually reinforcing, beginning with the historical marginalization of Hindus since partition, when systematic displacement and periodic pogroms, most notably during 1946-64 and again in 1989 following the Babri Masjid, Ram Temple dispute, reduced the Hindu population from roughly 28% in 1941 to under 8% today. A demographic collapse driven not by natural decline, but by fear-induced migration and structural dispossession. In contemporary Bangladesh, this legacy intersects with rising Islamist radicalism, as documented by academic and security analyses that trace the growing influence of extremist groups, the normalization of religiously coded political rhetoric, and the shrinking space for secular pluralism, trends that accelerate during periods of weak governance and transitional authority. Following the fall or weakening of entrenched political leadership, extremist actors and local strongmen often exploit power vacuums, targeting Hindus both ideologically and materially, since Hindu families disproportionately own valuable land that can be seized through intimidation once they are driven out, a pattern corroborated by field reports indicating that many attacks coincide with land disputes masked as communal outrage. International reporting from outlets such as ABC News and Human Rights Watch has further highlighted the human cost of this environment, citing testimonies from Bangladeshi Hindus who describe living as second-class citizens, enduring cycles of violence that spike with every political transition, and experiencing not only killings but widespread sexual violence, forced conversions, and social exclusion that rarely result in convictions, thereby embedding trauma across generations. At the same time, the narrative space surrounding these atrocities has become contested, with some Bangladeshi commentators and international observers cautioning against exaggeration by partisan media, while still acknowledging that violence against minorities is real, recurrent, and structurally enabled, a tension that complicates diplomatic engagement and often delays decisive international pressure even as victims continue to suffer. Regionally, the crisis has strained India-Bangladesh relations, as religious leaders, civil society groups, and sections of the Indian public demand stronger action to protect Bangladeshi Hindus, while the Bangladeshi state alternates between promises of investigation and assertions that incidents are isolated or politically motivated, responses that critics argue fail to address the systemic nature of the problem or to dismantle the networks that orchestrate violence at the local level. Viewed in totality, the present situation represents not just episodic communal unrest, but a sustained human rights emergency in which Bangladesh's Hindu minority faces existential insecurity shaped by history, politics, ideology, and economics. And unless meaningful accountability, institutional reform, and international monitoring are implemented, the cycle of violence, displacement, and demographic erosion is likely to continue, further hollowing out Bangladesh's pluralistic foundations and entrenching a tragic pattern in which each new political crisis is paid for with minority blood and silence. In conclusion, the unfolding crisis faced by Hindus in Bangladesh must be understood not merely as a series of tragic but disconnected incidents, nor as a transient phase tied only to momentary political instability, but as the cumulative outcome of decades of unresolved structural vulnerabilities that have repeatedly placed a religious minority at the mercy of power vacuums, ideological radicalisation, economic predation, and institutional failure, creating a reality in which violence becomes cyclical, displacement becomes normalized, and silence becomes a survival strategy. What makes the present moment especially grave is that the warning signs are no longer subtle or debatable, as the sheer frequency, geographic spread, and brutality of recent attacks, killings carried out in public spaces, homes torched with impunity, temples desecrated not in secrecy but in daylight, women assaulted with the confidence that justice will not follow, signal a breakdown not only of law enforcement, but of the moral contract between the state and its minorities, a contract that, when repeatedly violated, erodes faith in citizenship itself. History demonstrates with cruel consistency that when minorities are treated as politically expendable or socially alien, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victims, hollowing out democratic institutions, emboldening extremist actors, and fostering a culture in which violence becomes an acceptable tool of negotiation, redistribution, and domination. And Bangladesh now stands at precisely such a crossroads, where the continued marginalization of Hindus risks transforming a nation founded on linguistic and cultural pluralism into one defined by religious majoritarian fear. The demographic decline of the Hindu population is not simply a statistic, but a moral indictment, reflecting millions of individual decisions to flee ancestral homes, abandon temples that anchored community life, and sever cultural ties stretching back centuries, all because remaining has become synonymous with vulnerability. And when such an exodus occurs gradually, quietly, and repeatedly, it rarely provokes the urgency it deserves. Even though it represents one of the most enduring forms of ethnic and religious cleansing, attrition through terror rather than mass deportation. The state's recurring insistence that these attacks are isolated, exaggerated, or purely criminal rather than communal may serve short-term diplomatic or political needs, but it ultimately deepens mistrust, because patterns, not proclamations, define reality, and the pattern visible today is one in which accountability is rare. Investigations are delayed, convictions are exceptional, and perpetrators learn that violence against Hindus carries minimal consequence, thereby ensuring its repetition. Equally troubling is the normalization of moral relativism in public discourse, where the suffering of minorities is filtered through partisan loyalties or geopolitical anxieties, turning human rights into negotiable narratives rather than non-negotiable principles. And this erosion of empathy, this quiet acceptance that some lives are more vulnerable than others, marks the point at which a society begins to lose its ethical center. For the international community, continued hesitation, cautious language, and selective outrage risk reinforcing the very impunity that fuels these atrocities, because history shows that sustained international scrutiny, independent monitoring, and clear consequences for failure to protect minorities are often the only forces capable of altering state behavior when domestic incentives fall short. For India and the broader South Asian region, the crisis carries implications that extend beyond humanitarian concern, as persistent instability, forced migration, and communal polarization inevitably spill across borders, hardening identities, radicalizing discourse, and weakening regional trust at a time when cooperation is essential for economic resilience and security. Yet even amid this bleak landscape, the future is not predetermined, because cycles of violence are human-made and therefore human-reversible, provided there is political will to confront uncomfortable truths, dismantle networks of impunity, protect vulnerable communities proactively rather than reactively, and reaffirm, through action rather than rhetoric, that citizenship is not conditional upon faith. Safeguarding Bangladesh's Hindus is not a concession to external pressure, nor a favor to a minority, but a test of the nation's constitutional promise and moral maturity. For a state that cannot protect its most vulnerable ultimately endangers everyone, as the same forces that target minorities today will tomorrow demand new enemies. The true measure of Bangladesh's strength will not be found in its economic indicators or diplomatic balancing acts, but in whether a Hindu child can walk to school without fear, whether a temple can stand without police barricades, and whether justice can arrive swiftly enough to break the belief that violence is profitable. And until that reality is secured, the crisis will remain not a closed chapter but an open wound, one that continues to bleed quietly, persistently, and dangerously into the nation's future.